It was 1781, and a group of upstart colonists were celebrating a waving white flag at Yorktown, Virginia. America was a nation, and it was vast, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. With the Revolutionary War over, the hesitation to leave the established cities on the Atlantic coast was about to end. The newly independent Americans were about to get their first whiff of the intoxicating lure of heading west. It was a largely untouched expanse of wilderness. The Seneca Indians had lived there for generations, the animals for millennia. But to most whites, it might as well have been the moon. Yet western New York was about to be settled and developed, as the white people said. Western New York passed through the hands of a number of investors before it was purchased by a group of Dutch bankers called the Holland Land Company. In 1797, the company hired Joseph Ellicott to survey its 3.3 million acre parcel. One writer described the environment this way: the deer were startled from their hiding places, the wolves were driven from their lairs by the white men with compasses, chains, and flags. The red men looked on sullenly. 3 years later, the survey was finished. Ellicott had divided the company's land into townships and ranges, which could then be further subdivided and sold to settlers. Ellicott was named resident agent for the company, meaning he was charged with actually selling the land. Once land sales began, Ellicott kept in close touch with his superior, Paolo Busti, who was based in Philadelphia. After a brief stay in Clarence, Ellicott chose the bend of the Tonawanda Creek as his base of operations. At Busti's suggestion, Ellicott named the new settlement Batavia after the location of the Holland Land Company's headquarters in the Netherlands. This site had two immediate advantages. It was the crossroads of a series of Indian trails, which would make travel easier for pioneers looking to purchase land. And the creek provided power.
Well, in those days, their water power was the most important. And it was on the creek, and the creek had a lot of water power for their mill and any other thing that, and it was what we would still say was a main direct route for people. It had a path, where other places didn't even have a path. The Indians had worn the path to start it. So he would think, well, they've started it, and it looks like a pretty good path going this way and out north and out east and west. Seems to be a pretty good place.
But to utilize the Tonawanda's power, a dam had to be built, and that task fell to Joseph Ellicott and his brother, Benjamin.
And of course, one of the first things you had to do was have lumber to build houses. So he and his brother both got into the Tonawanda Creek waist high, and in 1 month they worked every day and night for 1 month to build a dam. And that was how they started to build, then they built a sawmill, and that was how it started.
Settlers came to western New York following the Indian paths which led through recently settled Leroy and Pavilion and on to Ellicott's primitive little settlement. These pioneers faced hard lives as they struggled to transform the still forested land into fertile fields. Many, though, came from the more densely settled East Coast, where land was far more expensive. Ellicott offered them a chance to own their own land, something they could never have afforded back east.
Well, it was the West to them then. They came from Massachusetts and up in that area, a lot of them, New England states. Time to press on and see what, there's something better, there's more wood. The land, we had a lot of forests, which was another good thing. Land to be cleared, they wanted to clear it. And the wood was good because it was expensive. Some of it was, in the other you could just burn or use any which way you wanted to. So seeing all this land and all these the woods, that once they were down, they knew the dirt was good and would grow crops. And I think that's what they thought about, the water and the wood, the most two important things then.
Genesee County was created in 1802, with Batavia as the county seat. One writer described the county at this time as an area that was still the haunt of Indians, whiskey traders, and wolves. This was no exaggeration.
At one of the first meetings of the Board of Supervisors in Genesee County, they spent most of their evening at the first meeting discussing the problem of the wolves, because you have to remember this entire area was still wooded, and the wolves became quite a problem. So they decided on the bounty that they would give for people bringing wolf pelts.
Ellicott sold land parcels to settlers from a log cabin near the corner of West Main Street and Dellinger Avenue. He also laid out 5 roads through the village. Buffalo Street, today's West Main. Genesee Street, what we call East Main. Big Tree Road, later renamed Ellicott Street. Court Street, and Jackson Street. Another trail ran north toward what Ellicott called the Pinery, 6 miles distant. Today, that road is called Oak Street. The pine forest was in Elba. With a sawmill and access to a stand of pine, frame houses began to appear, and Ellicott replaced his log cabin sales office with a frame structure. In 1802, Batavia consisted of 56 people, 2 taverns, which doubled as hotels, a general store run by Ellicott's friend James Brisbane, and the first courthouse west of the Genesee River. It was a 3-story affair, a combined courthouse, jail, and tavern. Ellicott ordered it built of oak to assure its permanence. It would later be called Ellicott Hall. A few hardy tourists came through the little settlement of Batavia, many on their way to see Niagara Falls. Their impressions of the area, though, were inconsistent, to say the least.
The street is perfectly level and is already a good and straight road,
wrote Timothy Bigelow in 1805. His impression of Russell's Tavern at the corner of State Street and Main was less glowing.
We were told that our sheaths were clean, since they had been slept in but a few times since being washed.
Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale College, mentioned the malaria-like illness which locals called the Genesee fever.
A more untoward situation, both for pleasantness and health, is not often selected for a town. So many persons were ill of the disease common to the region that those who remained well were scarcely able to nurse the sick. The waters, which had stagnated in the road, were very loathsome, both in appearance and smell.
The Irish poet Thomas Moore was positively disturbed by his visit to the area in 1804. Moore spent an evening in what he described as the miserable little backwoods settlement of Batavia. Later, Moore wrote the poem Song of the Evil Spirits of the Woods. Moore explained how the poem originated.
It started as an idea that occurred to me, in passing, through the very dreary wilderness of Batavia, a little settlement in the midst of the woods, in the village of Buffalo and Lake Erie.
For others, it was the act of traveling outside the village which made life challenging. The old Buffalo Road, today's Route 5, was so poor in 1805 that it took a family 3 days to move a load of household goods from Batavia to Williamsville, a total of 30 miles. Yet regardless of Thomas Moore's poetry, the Genesee fever, and the condition of the region's roads, the lure of affordable land brought settlers to Genesee County. The War of 1812 brought much unwelcome excitement to the 10-year-old pioneer community. As the British burned Buffalo and fighting spread to other settlements on the western edge of the state, soldiers and civilians fled east. Several local homes served as hospitals for soldiers wounded in battle. Joseph Ellicott's new frame land office temporarily became a military headquarters. The war was disruptive for residents. Numerous local men joined the fight, leaving farms untilled and subsequent food shortages in Genesee County. and the roads, if possible, became even worse. Asa Winter, a pioneer striking out for Michigan in 1812, wrote,
"The roads were so bad we were frequently obliged to stop so the horses could take breath. The roads grew worse and worse, cut up by army wagons, drawn by 4 to 6 horses, with mud literally up to the hubs."
The post-war period, though, also brought with it some positive changes. Peace brought new settlers. In 1810, Genesee County had a population of 23,000. 10 years later, it had grown to nearly 108,000. The war convinced the state legislature that the region needed a new arsenal to replace the 20-foot square, 12-foot tall log structure that had been built here, near the south end of the Walnut Street Bridge, just before the war began. A new stone arsenal was hastily constructed on the west end of the village. A Buffalo newspaper noted that,
The arsenal at Batavia belonging to the state of New York is now completed. The building is of stone, situated near the great road at the west end of the village, and makes an elegant appearance.
the old log arsenal was then used briefly and resourcefully as a distillery. Joseph Ellicott's decision to build a new land office was the war's most enduring change. During the fighting, Ellicott had the deeds and other records, and himself for that matter, sent east, safe from the fighting. After the war's conclusion, Ellicott hired Isaac Sutherland to build a fireproof office. The new Holland Land Office featured vaults protected by 1/2 inch thick, 9-foot tall metal doors. The new office opened in 1815. Across the street stood Ellicott's newly completed mansion, surely one of the grandest homes in western New York at that time. Other physical changes included the creation of a new jail on West Main Street, near today's Oak Street Extension Bridge, and a loan of $10,000 by the New York State Legislature for a new county courthouse to replace the aging Ellicott Hall. Built of cut stone from Leroy, the new building was finished in 1843 at a total cost of $17,000. Some years later, a quaintly attractive surrogate court building was constructed near the site where County Building 1 now stands. Buildings, though, were not the only changes which came to Batavia during this period. Railroad tracks reached Batavia around 1837. Names which today are mere curiosities: the Attica and Buffalo Railroad, the Niagara Bridge and Canandaigua Railroad, the Buffalo, New York, and Erie Railroad, would shortly transform the sleepy little village. By 1843, there was continual rail service from Buffalo to New York City. 10 years later, all lines between Buffalo and Albany were consolidated by the New York Central Railroad. Dean Richmond was vice president of the firm when he moved to Batavia in 1853. When he became president of the New York Central in 1864, every passenger train stopped in Batavia, whether or not riders got on or off. Suddenly, the horrific roads which had made long-distance travel so hellish mattered far less. Any town on the route of the railroad stood to gain. Access meant commerce, and Batavia was not served by just one track. A whole series of lines converged on the village. Still, visitors to Batavia around this time were no more unanimous in their appraisal of the village than they had been in the past. George Washington Johnson came through in 1833.
I got to Batavia at 1:30 in the morning. I wandered around the village all afternoon. The apples were in blossom, and the air was perfumed. The jail was new, but the courthouse was old and rickety. I slept at the Eagle Tavern. It was a poor concern. The sheets were dirty. The food at dinner was wretched. By God, I believed I would starve if I didn't get out of that hell soon.
Yet Charles Baker, a Vermont native on his way to Wisconsin, had this to say.
I found Batavia a delightful village with one main street, broad and lined with trees. and studded with beautiful villas and elegant mansions. There's a railroad from Batavia to Rochester, now in operation, being a link in the great railroad from Albany to Buffalo.
Batavia stood on the brink of tremendous change due largely to these rail connections. Then came the Civil War. Batavia businesses closed in April 1861, when word of the fighting at Fort Sumter reached town. Charles Rand was the first in the county to volunteer. Within a month, 3 companies from Genesee County had left to fight. Emory Upton became the most famous among the local soldiers. At the Battle of Winchester, General Upton was wounded in both legs. He had himself loaded onto a stretcher and brought forward to the front to continue directing his men. Battlefield heroism on the part of local men was not limited to General Upton. These medals were awarded to Edward Follett, grandfather of local resident Catherine Graff. Follett was a member of the 12th Regiment of the New York Infantry. President Lincoln's assassination brought to a close the nation's fratricidal conflict. Batavians watched solemnly as Lincoln's funeral train passed through the village early on Thursday morning, April 27, 1865. It was the end of an era. Batavia, like much of America, endured an economic downturn after the close of the war. Slowly, soldiers returned home and businesses were revived. By the 1870s, an economic resurrection had begun, and the village found itself in a most happy position. With its rail connections, Batavia became a player in the nationwide trend toward manufacturing for distant markets. Centrally located rail lines made it easy for manufacturers to bring raw materials in and ship finished goods to customers elsewhere. One by one, over the next 30 years, manufacturers began locating in Batavia. The Wired Plow Company came to Batavia in 1878. Wired located on Swan Street on a parcel of land purchased for it by villagers eager for jobs. The Batavia and New York Woodworking Company located at the corner of Buell and Elizabeth Streets in 1892. The firm specialized in fine woodworking, especially panels and doors. The Baker Gun Company was formed in Syracuse but moved to Batavia in 1889. E.N. Rowell's Box Manufacturing Concern came to Batavia in 1888. It located at the bank of the Tonawanda Creek at the corner of Ellicott and West Main in 1895. Rowell eventually opened an additional factory on Jefferson Avenue. Many other manufacturing operations set up shop in Batavia around this time. Colt Clamp, R.E. Chapin, the Armstrong Shoe Company, and the P.W. Minor Shoe Company, Doler Die Casting, the Mathis Company, which manufactured novelties made of shells which were then sold in tourist areas around the world, Horowitz and Sons shirt makers, and the Batavia Carriage Wheel Company, among others. The Massey Harris Company, originally called the Johnston Harvester Company, was the largest employer to come to Batavia during this period. Founded in Brockport in 1850, Johnston Harvester was looking for a new location when its plant burned in 1882. Batavians lobbied the firm and offered to purchase and donate the land necessary for the construction of a new plant on what was then called Cemetery Street. Batavia won out over other communities.
Anyways, Massey decided to come to Batavia, and there was so much enthusiasm and excitement over it that they had bonfires all up and down Main Street and up Harvester Avenue. And that, incidentally, was called Cemetery Street, and then they changed it to Harvester Avenue in memory of in honor of the Massey Harris Company. And they had parties all night. That brought the first big factory to Batavia. Batavia then became sort of a manufacturing plant city.
The influx of manufacturers created hundreds of new jobs. By the turn of the century, with the availability of employment, immigrants were encouraged by friends or relatives to locate in Batavia. Joseph Mancuso's father and grandfather had recently come to the United States from Italy. They were in New Orleans but were finding the going tough. They received a letter from a friend in Batavia.
He was down there for a while and they weren't doing too well. And he got a letter from a Mr. LaRussa, who lived on Liberty Street, and he said, why don't you guys come up here? My father then was about 11 or 12 years old, whatever it was. And my grandfather said, why don't you fellas move up here? You know, you can work at this it was Johnson Harvester at the time, I think. You could go to work there for $1 a day, and that was big money back in the, you know, in the early 20s. Well, it was around 1910, 1911 when they came here, and $1 a day was a big deal.
By this time, Batavia was a bustling community. The streets were packed with people, horses, buggies, and wagons. Salesmen came to town on the trains. These drummers, as they were called, stayed at some of the many hotels which were then located in Batavia. The Eagle Tavern was located at Main and Court Streets. When it burned in 1886, it was replaced by the Richmond Hotel. The Ellicott House stood at the corner of Ellicott and Jackson. The American Hotel was on Main Street. The Genesee House on Jackson Street, which was nearly as old as the village itself, offered guests a room and a shoeshine on the front porch. Streets were mostly of dirt, though there were some of cobblestone. A walk down Main Street heading west would take you past the old Carey homestead, Dean Richmond's mansion, the former home of Joseph Ellicott, the Holland Land Office building, and, on the west end of the village, the old stone arsenal. A little village no more, Batavia was hitting its stride. Batavia became a city in 1915. In that year, the city's streets were lit with power provided by the municipal building, at least until an explosion caused by sewer gas blew out the front of the building, killing a worker. A few years later, the city suffered a great loss when fire destroyed Ellicott Hall, which stood on Court Street. One of the last remainders of Batavia's pioneer past was gone. The former Brisbane home on West Main was then refurbished to serve as City Hall. By 1915, residents could choose among a variety of transportation methods. Railroads were still big business, still the quickest and surest way to cover long distances. Depots were attractive, exciting places, well-maintained, and some even carefully planted with flowers. Rail lines were also dangerous things. Today it is difficult to imagine the maze of tracks which ran near the corner of Ellicott and Jackson. And Batavia had its share of accidents and fatalities. Still, the massive engines were a source of delight to youngsters who sometimes climbed the trestle near Ellicott and Jackson to watch as the engine and its load passed beneath them.
That was one of the things that we kids used to do. I don't think it was dangerous, but coming up grade from the barn grade, coming up under there, boy, those engines puffed that smoke that had sparks in them, see? They would be, a freight would be coming along under there. Boy, they were chugging like mad because of the barn grade. And we could stand up on that bridge. And when the engine went under, we'd hold our nose, shut our eyes, you know, that was, that was about it.
A trolley began running on Main Street in 1903. The tracks ran 1.5 miles from the car barns on Clinton Street to the junction of West Main and Lewiston Road on the west end of the city. The completion of the trolley's construction was cause for celebration.
They hired almost all Italian people, men, to work on the trolley tracks, and they laid the tracks. They started on the east end where the car, where Trojan was. They call that the car works. They finished the trolley car up, the tracks up, and they had a big celebration on a Saturday. And Batavia was very excited about it, and they had people, so many people out that they swarmed right up to the tracks. Also, everybody on the entire length of Main Street decorated their homes in honor of the trolley that was coming to Batavia, and they shot skyrockets over the trolley as it passed. It cost a nickel to ride the trolley. You could ride from the east end to the west end and back for a nickel.
Morris Johnson, who grew up on Clinton Street near the car barns, relied on the trolley for a ride home from downtown on Saturday nights. But first he had to wait for his brother.
My brother got enamored with a girl that was a waitress in Young's Restaurant. And of course me, I was up there, and I'd get so bitchin' mad because he wouldn't come home, you know. But finally, at the last streetcar came, we'd have to get on to come around the corner, you know, from uptown around the corner, and we'd get out here when they were going into the car barns. That was our ride, see? And the motorman knew it. And I can't think of the name of the motorman, George somebody. I wish I could remember his name, but they knew who we were, you know.
Along with a way to get around, the trolleys offered a form of entertainment to some of the youngsters in town.
We as kids used to do that. That's a long time ago. When the trolleys were running and they still had the thing, you know, hooked to the wire up above. It was customary for us fellas trying to get in a little bit of trouble, running up, grabbing the thing and pulling it down, and it would stop the trolley. And then the guy'd get out, scream and holler and put it back on.
The Tonawanda Creek offered a more leisurely, recreational form of transportation. Boat rides were a common form of entertainment around this time. Ed and Joe Follett built the Irene and the Cynthia, but it is the Bluebird which most Batavians remember best. The Folletts launched the Bluebird in 1910. The 32-foot-long oak and cypress boat was powered by a 30-horsepower engine. Passengers could savor the beauty of the Tonawanda Creek and often ended up at Meadow Park, where for many years dancing was popular. Batavians also enjoyed picnics and baseball games at the park. The Bluebird was swept away in the flood of 1922. It was never found. The lazy pleasures of a 12-mile-per-hour boat ride surely seem to belong to another era. Indeed, they do. A languid trip up the Tonawanda Creek was a pleasant enough way to pass a summer afternoon. But then something new arrived in town. It was called the automobile. And gradually, everything changed. The contraptions began appearing shortly after the turn of the century. By 1915, there were 1,000 in Genesee County. Of course, the automobile did not immediately supplant the older established forms of transportation. For a long time, street space was shared by horses, trolley cars, and the auto. In time, though, changes occurred. Hitching posts gave way to street-side diagonal slots for the cars. Stoplights became common. Dirt streets, which were easy on horses' hooves, gave way to the laying of pavement. As pavement expanded, the street sprinkler, which helped keep the dust down on dirt streets, was edged into oblivion, and with it the insidious sprinkler tax levied on city property owners. For a time, there was a single gasoline pump on Main Street. Horses remained on city streets for years, though in ever-dwindling numbers. Still, where there were horses, there was the inevitable need to clean up after them.
At that time, you know, we still had horses running around, and they had dump wagons with horses, and so they left a few trails up and down the street. And this fella used to walk up and down the street with a two-wheel cart, and he'd pick up all this stuff and throw it in there and keep the streets clean. And he was a great guy. His name was Cicero. And he was not a big man, but he was a good guy, and he had a great sense of humor. And every time you'd say to him, "Hey, how's business?" he'd say, "Picking up," you know, which was cute, because that's exactly what his business was.
The nationwide debate over temperance was played out in two of downtown's social clubs. The Batavia Club, which featured a bar, was wet. Across the street stood the Holland Club, which was dry. Batavia also had a chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU erected a drinking fountain at the corner of Main and Jackson in 1904 to offer a wholesome drink to anyone or anything with a thirst.
The monument had a place for adults to drink, and I used to drink out of it when I was downtown. And then a lower place for children, and at the bottom a place for animals to drink, dogs and so on.
America entered the First World War in April 1917. Over 1,000 Genesee County men served in the armed forces during the war, 71 of whom died. Local residents also did their part. 3 city men arranged to make a victory garden on the old Sweezy property where Easttown Plaza now stands. Morris Johnson, a lifelong farmer, recalls the area and offers the effort praise.
That whole area by where the store is now was garden, beautiful soil. And so the 3 of them took that piece of land there and grew plants and vegetables and things. And this was during World War I, and that was their opportunity to help. I mean, they had some good gardens. They were city boys, but they had help, you know, knew what to do.
The war's end was celebrated on Main Street with a massive parade. Returning soldiers and civilians alike toasted the